I'm going to start it off with a round of questions. My first question would be that the administration often mentions 21st century trade issues as a goal of TPP. What are these issues, and why are they important to the U.S. economy? Dr. Barfield, would you like to take a first crack at it?
I think Scott went into this to some degree. They are issues that he talked about in terms of the new digital economy, of moving. And I should say that what has happened is that as the trade negotiations have gone over the decades, you've gone from trade barriers such as tariffs that were outside the border to the kinds of things that you find inside the border of regulations. And now we have new technology such as the new digital economy, which trade rules to date have not handled. And so the 20th century, the term 20th century agreement means that you're really looking at issues that had not been looked at before or only briefly looked at, such as regulatory issues, whether it's health and safety, whether it's environment or whatever. So it's kind of, it is an inside the border and regulatory framework that you're trying to change in the direction of allowing a free flow of trade and investment.
Thank you. Ms. Overby, did you, or Mr. Miller, did you want to?
If I could add briefly, yes, I agree with Claude. Classically defined as the electronic commerce and telecom issues, cross-border data flows being the most important for business operations, not just Internet firms and high-tech firms, but all firms operate with a lot of coordination, and free flow of data is critical to operation. Second, in competition policy, which has been an older subject of trade, one of the things that's added in the TPP is the consideration of state-owned enterprises and how to treat state-owned enterprises when they and how to manage their competitive neutrality to make sure they operate the way that normal competitive companies do. I would also add regulatory cooperation or regulatory coherence is an important part. This is one of the behind-the-border issues that is a bigger part of trade frictions today than it was 1 or 2 decades ago. Finally, in the intellectual property chapter, there's good work going on safe harbors for Internet service providers, which is consistent with U.S. law and practice, as well as measures to protect high technology innovators in foreign markets.
One other question, Mr. Miller. Would those safeguards on these issues, whether it's intellectual property or many of the other issues that you mentioned, would they happen if we're not part of it?
It's unlikely. The United States has raised these issues. Frankly, it's U.S. firms that are on the frontier of commercial innovation in these sectors. Mostly in most trade negotiations, economies raise the issues that are most important to their industries. And for the U.S. companies, these come to a high level that probably wouldn't happen if we were absent from the TPP negotiations.
One of the arguments against TPP is that our trade deficit with FTA partners has actually increased in aggregate. However, my understanding is our overall trade deficit peaked in 2006 at $760 billion. Since then, it's actually decreased to $505 billion. So trade balances with FTA partners have actually improved, at least as far as I'm reading the statistics. Is the trade deficit issue of particular concern to the negotiators, and should it be? Ms. Overby, would you like to address that?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the trade balance is actually a poor measure of success of U.S. agreements. In macroeconomic terms, the U.S. overall trade deficit reflects an imbalance in our consumption and our savings, not our trade agreements. Until we save more than we consume, the U.S. will continue to run a deficit on a global basis. However, if we take as a group, the U.S. ran an aggregate trade surplus with its FTA partner countries in 2012 and 2013, and this surplus has grown since then. In fact, the U.S. has recorded a trade surplus in manufactured goods with its FTA partners for each of the past 5 years, according to our Department of Commerce. This surplus reached $27 billion in 2009 and has expanded to $61 billion by 2013.
Thank you. And then lastly, I just have time for one more question. The issue of currency manipulation. Is there any evidence that by itself currency manipulation is damaging to our economy?
I'm no expert on this matter, but I'll take the advice of Fed Chairman Janet Yellen, who was asked about currency manipulation in trade agreements at a recent Senate Banking Committee hearing. She mentioned, acknowledged the issue was an issue, but said that the United States had defensive issues here, and that doing her job of managing U.S. fiscal policy might be constrained if we were to negotiate this in trade agreements. I would note also there are certain things that are important to trade and affect trade that we don't consider in trade agreements. I would note farm subsidies is one of those. I don't think there's any debate that farm subsidies do have an effect on farm pricing, but the United States has never negotiated them within a bilateral free trade agreement.
Ms. Overby.
Yes, we agree currency manipulation is a very serious problem in international trade, and we're encouraged that the administration and Congress are working to find solutions. The Chamber's view is that disputes over currency deserve a full airing, but the questions are, what's the right forum and what measures can be effective? Historically, governments have tackled currency matters in a very broad fora, such as the IMF, G20, or G7. This is because governments have seen currency valuation and current account imbalances as global in nature and not effectively addressed with a single partner or a small collection of partners. Most international policymakers and experts want to be sure that we don't tie the hands of the Fed or the Treasury Department with enforceable currency provisions in TPP or any U.S. trade agreement. Our institutions need to be able to determine our own monetary and fiscal policies and be able to respond in a crisis. The other TPP partners have, as Mr. Sherman mentioned, indicated that they do not want currency provisions in an agreement.
Thank you. I've run out of time. Mr. Sherman.